Hey, Aaron, can you get those doors? You like that? I didn't realize how far back I was. Y'all changing your membership to the West Side Church? All right, good morning. I think I have the same problem Keaton does. Good morning, good morning, good morning. Everybody are very enthusiastic fellowshippers, but this isn't the fellowship class. So. I said, go get in your seat. She's up here hassling me. All right, so last week we embarked on a study of the 9 commandments, as we joked, and I mentioned this to somebody when I started the prep for last week. Got down into the notes a good bit, and decided that I really would like to have a consolidated list of just the commandments, so I could reference that if I needed to, because I don't remember them off the top of my head, as I told you. And I realized when I got to number 10 and I had a blank, that what I had been doing was going through the verses and just breaking the verses apart and had like a section and just wrote out what it was. And I had combined no gods and no idols, right? So no other gods and no idols come pretty close together, and it's the others are kind of broken out visually in the text. And those two are stuck together, and I missed it. I said, wait a minute, what have I done here? And had to go back and fix that. And it is a very similar topic, right? No idols. And I think a lot of times we bind those two things together in our minds, and it kind of begs the question, right? Why did God say both of those things as specifically distinct commandments, right? And normally at this point I'd ask the question, like, why did he do that? But somebody probably would answer it, and then we'd all have nothing left to do for the rest of class. So we'll just hold that in our minds rhetorically, right? All right, so Exodus chapter 20 and verse 4. You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. So what does this commandment specifically say? Like, boil it down, what does it say, right? And I think we can just summarize it as that there's no physical representations of God allowed, right? And so God always explains himself, right? The scripture is its own interpreter, and God always tells us these things. But sometimes he doesn't tell us things as black and white and direct as I might like, right? And I think this is one of those commands. We can probably infer some reasons why it would be this way or that way, but God's a little bit less direct in what he says about it. So looking on down in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 4, we can kind of get an idea, and you may say this is direct, but it's maybe less detailed than I would prefer. But Deuteronomy 4 and 15 through 31. And I told Tricia this morning that we've got some really long readings today, and I apologize for that. But as I set about to edit them and take chunks and sections out to make it more palatable in terms of a class like this, it really just, there's things in all of the sections that are valuable and that are there for a reason, and I just couldn't take it out. So I hope you'll bear with me as we read through some long readings today. Verse 15, Deuteronomy 4. Therefore, watch yourselves very carefully, since you saw no form on the day that the Lord spoke to you at Horeb out of the midst of the fire. Beware lest you act corruptly by making a carved image for yourselves in the form of any figure, the likeness of male or female, the likeness of any animal that is on the earth, the likeness of any winged bird that flies in the air, the likeness of anything that creeps on the ground, the likeness of any fish that is in the water under the earth. And beware lest you raise your eyes to heaven, and when you see the sun and the moon and the stars and all the host of heaven, you be drawn away and bow down to them and serve them, things that the Lord your God allotted to all the peoples under the whole heaven. But the Lord has taken you and brought you out of the iron furnace, out of Egypt, to be a people of his own inheritance, as you are this day. Furthermore, the Lord was angry with me because of you, and he swore that I should not cross the Jordan, and that I should not enter the good land that the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. For I must die in this land. I must not go over the Jordan, but you shall go over and take possession of that good land. Take care lest you forget the covenant of the Lord your God, which he made with you, and make a carved image, the form of anything that the Lord your God has forbidden you. For the Lord your God is a consuming fire, a jealous God. When you father children and children's children and have grown old in the land, if you act corruptly by making a carved image in the form of anything, and by doing what is evil in the sight of the Lord your God, so as to provoke him to anger, I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that you will soon utterly perish from the land that you are going over the Jordan to possess. You will not live long in it, but will be utterly destroyed, and the Lord will scatter you among the peoples, and you will be left few in number among the nations where the Lord will drive you. And there you will serve gods of wood and stone, the work of human hands, that neither see nor hear nor eat nor smell. But from there you will seek the Lord your God, and you will find him if you search after him with all your heart and with all your soul. When you are in tribulation, and these things will come upon you in the latter days, you will return to the Lord your God and obey his voice, for the Lord your God is a merciful God. He will not leave you or destroy you or forget the covenant with your fathers that he swore to them. So a lot there. Says, therefore watch yourselves very carefully, since you saw no form on the day the Lord spoke to you at Horeb, right? And I think that's kind of the extent that we see of God explaining himself on this topic. And I think what he's saying is, you have no idea what I look like. So don't endeavor to produce an image that represents me, right? So it would be offensive to God for us to look at the things that he created and try to bind him into that, right? So what do you guys think? Do we have additional evidence as to why we wouldn't create, or why God said, have no other gods before me, and made the distinction about idols? Rocky?
God wants us to focus on spiritual things, and the tendency to build idols is to focus on physical things. So God has indeed revealed himself to us through his word. He's revealed himself through the creation that he made. We can look at that, and we can, if we pay attention, we can see all kinds of things about God. All these things that he's given us to reveal himself through is not what a human being would create by some little statue or some little idol or something like that. And that's what he didn't want. As much as we often think about idols as being, false gods, they could actually build representations of the true God. Like there's
Yeah, we're going to get there. Yeah. So when God said, "Let us make man in our image," right? Was he talking about like a snapshot of himself, or was he talking about, as Rocky says, the spirit, right? God is a spirit, right? So the image that we're made in isn't some physical representation, right? But rather his nature, right? We're made in a form of his nature, right? If you look in verse 16 of chapter 4 there, it says, "Beware lest you act corruptly." So we're starting right off with a word that I think we all kind of have some connotation of, but I'm not sure that it was. If you look in the current dictionary, the definitions are, in my opinion, a little light and a little bit circular, right? But looking back at the Hebrew word and how Strong's defines it, the connotation is to spoil or to be rotten, right? The handwriting there is really terrible, and I can't read what that other word was. But so the basic idea here is, if you make this image, right? If you do something along that line, you're corrupting, you're making it spoiled or rotten, the relationship between you and God, right?
Us, man, generally, when they make a physical representation, and you can look back on this through all the mythology and the Greek and Roman mythology, they made physical images to represent their gods. And over time, they continued to, I guess, attribute certain physical characteristics to their gods because now they have this image. And I think it works for us the same way. We may make an image that, there's nothing wrong with the image, if you will, but we tend to attribute more and more characteristics to that image as we begin to worship or set that image up as a god.
Right, so it evolves, right? So it maybe starts out as an innocent thing and then progressively, maybe years later, have totally lost the plot, as the English would say, right? That the reason that was put in, completely harmless. I've never been a really big fan of slippery slope arguments, right? But I think a lot of times we have to have that slippery slope argument about things that maybe somebody would like to do, and wiser folks can see down the line of that kind of drift happening, right? So is it pharisaical to draw a hedge around it? Maybe. Is it wise? Probably, right?
Well, you can look no further than some of the churches in modern day Christendom, the denominations in modern day Christian. And a lot of those, in fact, the major one, and I'm not going to call out anybody here, but the major one has a large focus on image and imagery. And I don't want to say idols, but in effect, they're statues, they're idols. And they literally, there's a certain amount of worship attributed to those images.
Funny thing, I had the same response as you. I had that feeling, but I left the specifics out of the lesson. Yeah, so let's not name names and throw stones, but I think everybody will eventually, if you don't already know, come to the same opinion. All right. So this is kind of non sequitur, right? But I put in here Isaiah 55, 8 and 9. It says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, and neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts." And as I was thinking about the lesson, that verse kind of came to me that God just is so far beyond our concept, right? that it's hubris for us to think that we could put it into words even, or some kind of icon, right? Oddly enough, this a couple of weeks ago, I did a very high quality and well-researched sort of presentation on trademarks. Basically watched a LinkedIn Learning video and then made some PowerPoint slides. It was really authentic. But we just don't have any relationship to what God is thinking, and we're almost infringing on him if we try to make something out of our own thoughts, right? Oh yes, so going back to verse 19, I kind of mentioned this already, but there's another piece that gives us a little bit of a clue why God was doing this. It says, "And beware, lest you raise your eyes to heaven, and when you see the sun and the moon and the stars, all the hosts of heaven, you will be drawn away and bow down to them and serve them. Things that the Lord your God has allotted to all the peoples under the whole heaven. But the Lord has taken you and brought you out of the iron furnace, out of Egypt, to be the people of his own inheritance, as you are this day." And so, in addition to you don't understand me, there's also this aspect of, if you're looking at the things that God's created, those were created for everybody, right? All humans are under the sun and the moon, and you benefit from those things. But talking to the nation of Israel, they were God's chosen people, and he's saying, you're special, and I've given you special things, right? So to be a people of his own inheritance, right? So like we talked about last week, God has this desire to have a relationship with us, but that also means that we need to be different than those that are around us, right? So, notes got a little bit messy. If we look in a little further down in chapter 4 of Deuteronomy, starting in verse 32, it's, "For ask now of the days that are past, which were before you, since the day that God created man on earth, and ask from one end of heaven to the other whether such a great thing as this has ever happened or was ever heard of. Did any people ever hear the voice of a little g God speaking out of the midst of the fire, as you have heard, and still live? Or has any God ever attempted to go and take a nation for himself from the midst of another nation, by trials, by signs, by wonders, and by war, by a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, and by great deeds of terror, all of which the Lord your God did for you in Egypt before your eyes? To you it was shown that you might know that the Lord is God. There is no other beside him. Out of heaven he let you hear his voice, that he might discipline you. And on earth he let you see his great fire, and you heard his words out of the midst of the fire. And because he loved your fathers and chose their offspring after them, and brought you out of Egypt with his own presence, by his great power, driving out before you nations greater and mightier than you, to bring you in and give you their land for an inheritance as it is this day. Know therefore today, and lay it to your heart, that the Lord is God in heaven above and the earth beneath. There is no other. Therefore you shall keep his statutes and his commandments, which I command you today, that it may go well with you and with your children after you, and that you may prolong your days in the land that the Lord your God is giving you for all time." So what we see there is God giving evidence against all these other idols, right? He says, show me the time when any of these images, these golden calves maybe, right, have done anything for you, right? But I can show you evidence where I saved you from Egypt. I spoke to you. You heard me, right? So a lot of these other gods, the people didn't hear them speak. Only their sort of priests or their the people in charge of the religion heard the God speak, right? But the children of Israel heard God's voice, all of them. They didn't necessarily understand what he said, but they knew he was speaking with Moses, right? They were terrified. when they heard it. So God's also giving here, and we saw in the other section, there's a sort of a blessing and a curse to all of this, right? If you stick with me, you're going to have good times. If you go to these other gods, then you're on your own because they won't deliver anything for you. Thoughts about that? Anybody have comments? Yes, sir. Oh, sorry. I thought I saw Rocky moving.
Yeah. So I think your comment is very relevant to where we are today, where we've always been, but where we are today, because your comment gets to the heart of the fact that we are much less in control than we want to believe. And so because of that, we do a lot of things to give us that false sense of security. You know, with that, if that false sense of security comes through false gods, then that's a real problem. The challenge is, right? How do we allow God to be God in a way that He wants us to, right? It's how do we allow God to have that relationship with us? How do we have that relationship with God as God desires for that relationship to exist? And I think that's a real challenge for us today in sort of our modern.
Yeah, so if y'all couldn't hear Robert, what he was saying basically is that we don't have the level of control in our lives that we maybe try to exert or think that we do, and we may then be attempting to fill that power void, if you will, with something that's not God. And how do we address the topic of making God prevalent or number one, right? Was that a sort of fair summary? Yeah, how do we allow actual God to be God? And I think that's an important topic personally, but I also think it's an important topic congregationally, right? And we're going to have, if I manage my time better, we're going to have an opportunity to talk about that. Yes, Marcy?
I don't know where I was taught this. It could have been in a 4- and 5-year-old class that I taught, but I need to get out of the driver's seat and let God drive the bus.
Okay. Marcy says she needs to allow God to be the driver. It's like the old bumper sticker, God's my co-pilot. That's wrong, right? God's your pilot and you're along for the ride. I feel like that's probably common for everybody. Yes, Jack?
I've always thought of God as being our Father, Heavenly Father, sitting on this huge throne, much larger than we human beings, but same image. And that Heavenly Father sent His Son to rescue us from our sinfulness. And so we, through Christ, we become adopted in that family. And to me, it's a wonderful way to think of God. When I talk with God, I talk with Him like I would a human God who knew a lot more than I did. And the God in heaven knows me inside and out. So coming to Him on a daily basis, talking about the strengths of my weaknesses, I have the image of Him sitting on a throne, very much larger than I, but in the same image as a human being. He sent His Son, represented by a human being, and has gathered His children, and is gathering His children together, be with Him forever in heaven. To me, it's not a statue, it's not an image that is out of the Scriptures. It's an image of who God is and how He wants us to think about it.
So I had a little trouble hearing you there, but I think what you were talking about was that God is real in heaven and has power, right, versus an image. Did I pick that up? Okay. So let's move on. A couple of examples. I think everybody knows Exodus 32. So Exodus 20, you get the 10 Commandments, and then there's a whole bunch of little regulations and things that God is giving Moses. He's on the mountain, And God says, uh-oh, there's a problem down there. And we see in Exodus 32, verse 1, that the people have started to get restless. It says, when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered themselves together to Aaron and said to him, up, make us gods who shall go before us. As this Moses, the man who brought us up from out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. So Aaron said to them, take off the rings of gold that are in the ears of your wives, your sons, your daughters, and bring them to me. So all the people took off the rings of gold that were in their ears and brought them to Aaron, and he received the gold from their hand and fashioned it with a graving tool and made a golden calf rather. And they said, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. When Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it, and Aaron made a proclamation and said, tomorrow shall be a feast to the Lord. There's a lot of stuff going on in this passage, but a couple of things I wanted to note. When this happens, it's hard to understand what Aaron's thinking was and why the people, how long was Moses gone? It didn't seem like he was really gone long enough to come to this level of a crisis, but, you know, Satan's always moving. We get here, I think it's important to note, they said, meaning that this congregation, this crowd of people who are inciting Aaron to make this idol are the ones that proclaimed that these are gods. It wasn't Aaron that said that. And it's almost like Aaron has had a revelation. Uh-oh, what have I done, right? So somebody mentioned that the image doesn't always have to be a separate God, that it can be an image of the true God, right? And that's also wrong. And I think that's what Aaron's attempting to do here, is to morph this back. Oh, he's trying to, I made a mistake, so let me just rearrange this a little bit. And he builds an altar and says that there's going to be a feast to the Lord. So he's kind of pulling this idol and God together. And the word that's used there for Lord in my ESV, that Lord is all capitalized. But it's the word Jehovah. So it's very clear that Aaron's saying, we're going to have a feast to the true God and with this altar in front of this image, right? So he's definitely associating them. And I think that maybe that's in what Aaron's trying to do would be sort of a distinction without a difference as far as God's concerned. But I think it's important for us to consider what he's doing so that we don't also do the same thing, right? That he's trying to turn this man-made image to something that represents the actual God. Another couple of examples of good things where people followed God and didn't go along with idolatry. In Judges 6, 24 to 34, says, then Gideon built an altar there to the Lord and called it, the Lord is Peace. To this day it still stands at Ophrah, which belongs to the Abiezrites. That night the Lord said to him, take your father's bull and the second bull 7 years old and pull down the altar of Baal that your father has and cut down the Asherah that is beside it. And build an altar to the Lord your God on top of the stronghold here, with stones laid in due order. Then take the second bull and offer it as a burnt offering with the wood of the Asherah that you shall cut down. So Gideon took 10 men of his servants and did as the Lord told him. But because he was too afraid of his family and the men of the town to do it by day, he did it by night. When the men of the town rose early in the morning, behold, the altar of Baal was broken down, and the Asherah beside it was cut down, and the second bull was offered on the altar that had been built. And they said to one another, who has done this thing? And after they searched and inquired, they said, Gideon, the son of Joash, has done this thing. Then the men of the town said to Joash, bring out your son that he may die, for he has broken down the altar of Baal and cut down the Asherah beside it. But Joash said to all who stood against him, will you contend for Baal, or will you save him? Whoever contends for him shall be put to death by morning. If he is a god, let him contend for himself, because his altar has been broken down. Therefore on that day Gideon was called Jerubbaal, that is to say, let Baal contend against him, because he broke down his altar. Now all the Midianites and Amalekites and the people of the east came together, and they crossed the Jordan and encamped at the valley of Jezreel. But the Spirit of the Lord clothed Gideon, and he surrounded And he sounded the trumpet, and the Abiezrites were called out to follow him. So there's a lot of stuff there. We're going to cover a little bit of it in a few minutes. So Gideon was given an instruction to tear down these idols. He did that, and then it says the Spirit of the Lord clothed him, right? So it seems like because of his obedience, God is now beginning to bless him. And another example in 2 Kings 18, verses 1 through 7. In the 3rd year of Hosea, son of Elah, king of Israel, Hezekiah, the son of Ahaz, king of Judah, began to reign. He was 25 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 29 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Abi, the daughter of Zechariah, and he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, according to all that David his father had done. He removed the high places and broke the pillars and cut down the Asherah, and he broke in pieces the bronze serpent that Moses had made. For until those days the people of Israel had made offerings to it. It was called Nehushtan. He trusted in the Lord, the God of Israel, so that there was none like him among all the kings of Judah after him, nor among those who were before him. For he had held fast to the Lord. He did not depart from following him, but kept the commandments of the Lord that the Lord commanded Moses. And the Lord was with him. Whenever he went out, he prospered. He rebelled against the king of Assyria and would not serve him. So obviously the point of reading all that was that, he followed God. He took the idols out, refocused the people on the true God, and the Lord prospered him. But also of note is you see that, you remember God told Moses to make a serpent so that the plague, if you will, would go away. So hold the serpent image up, and the people that looked on it were saved. And I think that goes to what Mark was talking about, right? This thing that started with pure intentions, over time, people have become unfocused, maybe, and started to ascribe a power to that thing. And you see the same kind of thing with the Ark of the Covenant, right? At some point, it becomes like a talisman. The army wants to march the ark out because if the ark goes out, then it'll take care of all their enemies and they can't lose. And of course, they were wrong and they end up losing the ark. And then there's a whole bunch of story there about getting that back. So, once again, very close to the end of the class. On a New Testament class, we will join the New Testament, right? Well, before we go on, does anybody have any comments about the stuff that we've been talking about? Okay. So in 1 Corinthians 10, verse 1, "For I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink. For they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. Nevertheless, with most of them God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. Now these things took place as examples for us, that we might not desire evil as they did. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. We must not indulge in sexual immorality, as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in a single day. We must not put Christ to the test, as some of them did, and were destroyed by serpents, nor grumble, as some of them did, and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of ages has come. Therefore, let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed lest he fall. No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability, but with the temptation he will also provide a way of escape, that you may be able to endure it. Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. I speak as to sensible people. Judge yourselves what I say. The cup of blessing that we bless is it not a participation in the blood of Christ? The bread that we break, is it not a participation in the body of Christ? Because there is one bread, we who are many are one body, for we all partake of one bread. Consider the people of Israel, are not those who eat the sacrifices participants in the altar? What do I imply then? That the food offered to idols is anything, or that an idol is anything? No, I imply What pagan sacrifice they offer to demons and not to God. I do not want you to be participants with demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake the table of the Lord and the table of demons. Shall we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than he? So we've said the whole principle of the class is that we'll look at an Old Testament commandment, and then we'll find it in the New Testament. So what we see there in that verse is talking very much about resisting idols, and slightly different to today. I think the Corinthians obviously had a whole lot more prevalence of idol worship, right? All the temples and things that were there in their city than we do. It was maybe a little more direct read across from God and idol than what we deal with in modern times. But why did God restate this commandment, right? So last week we said God restated, you shall have no other gods before me, because he hasn't changed. But this week I think we look in that section of verses at 1 Corinthians 10:21. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. So this distraction of idols, right? It puts us into a camp that's opposed to God. God will not associate with us, so he has restated this so we know that we have to be simple-minded, really. We're with God. There isn't any other thing that's equal. Luke 16:13, I think everybody's very familiar with this verse. No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. And then in Luke 12:15-21, and he said to them, take care and be on guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. And he told them a parable, saying, the land of a rich man produced plentifully. And he thought to himself, what shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops. And he said, I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store all my grain and goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many, many, many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, fool, this night your soul is required of you. And the things you have prepared, whose will they be? So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. And in a notes, I skipped over something. I apologize. Can somebody read Colossians 3, verse 5, please? And while you're looking for that, the question that I should have posed to you, and I kind of skipped over, is, has idolatry changed? Right? So I kind of said that it was very obvious in Paul's time that these are temples, and it's not so obvious now. Do we think that this commandment applies to things differently now? So somebody have that Colossians 3:5.
On the earth, fornication, uncleanness, inordinate affection, evil concubines, and covetousness, which is idolatry.
Right. So I would say that's very much telling us that, yes, there's a, esoteric is the wrong word. There's the direct meaning, the literal meaning, and then there's the sort of deeper meaning behind things of idolatry that says it doesn't necessarily have to be an image, an icon, right? It can be an idea, a concept as well, right? And then that's where we see, that's where these other, the Luke 16:13 verse and the Luke 12:15 verse come into play, that basically, in these two cases, things, materialism, money, have become idols to these people. Yes, Rocky?
In 1 Samuel 15, verse 23, Samuel told Saul when he disobeyed God and didn't kill all the Amalekites, he said, for rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry. So even in the Old Testament, there was that concept that we combine with the verses you just read in Colossians 3, verse 5, is anything that we place as important more than God in our mind, that becomes an idol. Because what is stubbornness? Stubbornness is where I put my will before God's will, and it's equated as idolatry here. So all the commandments that God has given us to do, when we choose, I don't want to do this one because I don't like it, I don't want to do that one because I don't like it, what are we doing? We're making ourselves a God unto ourselves, and therefore we become idolatrous because we're not following God's law. That's the concept that God has had from the very beginning, basically.
Yeah, thank you, Rocky. That's good. That was a good call-out verse. I like that. All right, so real quickly, let's talk about, can idolatry happen in the church? Heads nodding. How might that manifest itself? Keaton?
I mean, idolatry at its core is anytime we place something above God. I mean, just, that's a 30,000-foot view. But so, to answer your last question, can idolatry be something that's not a physical image? Absolutely. I mean, I would say the vast majority of things that we will struggle with in terms of idolatry are not physical things. They're priority, it's time, it's where we place those kind of resources. And we struggle with that idea of, Satan would love for us to believe that idolatry is just a golden calf, right? That as long as it's church and God adjacent, it can't be idolatry, right? He would rejoice 10 times over if we all believed that. But the reality is when we come, just as an example, we're here, right? We come to church, we think, hey, I'm in the pew, right? But we don't engage, we're not doing the things we're called to do. We are, in turn, placing other things above the priority of God. So we might not articulate that as idolatry, but anything that comes above worship, it comes above relationship, it comes above God himself and our relationship to him, by its definition is idolatry. So if we're here, but we're not here, our mind's elsewhere, then whatever our mind is on is idolatry, because it's coming between us and God. So, very much. The church can very much struggle with, where do we place our time, where do we place our mind, where do we place our priority, and we can be here, and if we are mentally elsewhere, that thing has become an idol.
And absolutely true. I kind of appreciate that maybe is a little bit more personal, right? I was thinking more in terms of the congregation, right? But it always starts at a personal level, right?
The individual becomes the sum, right?
Yeah.
But yes, I'll let somebody else comment on it, but the church can very much struggle with that, because we individually can struggle with that, and the sum total becomes the church.
Yeah, technically we're in overtime now. So, all right. Thank you guys. Appreciate it.